a good deal for you. You know, you might think, well, that's, sanity's in my head. It's like, what makes you think you can regulate yourself? You're pretty goddamn complicated, So we regulate ourselves socially. That's why we talk to each other. It's vital.
That's so interesting. I feel like, once again, what you're saying, I feel like I'm like struck with my pride a little bit. Like I feel like I can regulate myself. I can always aim up or try to do what is right and think, well, I guess I'm still basing my decision making, because a heuristic I use a lot of the time when I'm trying to decide what to do between like a moral conundrum is like, what would the optimal person in this situation do? And completely remove myself from this situation. And then I do that. But I guess that's also relating.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
that's what you've done. Well, that's right. What you've done
yeah.
to some. That's a good observation. What you've done to some degree is you've constructed an idealized representation of another, or a human being for that matter. That's like the Son of Man in the Christian conception. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what you're doing when you do that is no different from what, say, evangelical Christians do when they ask themselves, what would Jesus do? It's exactly the same thing.
And it's pulled from real people. It's just certain components about them. So they're still technically impressing upon me.
Yeah. You're essentially fabricating out of whole cloth something approximating a classic religious orientation. What would someone who is ideal do in this situation? Well, see, if you delved into that, this is where the religious investigation would take place. It's like, okay, who is this ideal that you're calling upon? What's the characterization of that ideal? You could write that all down. You'd see what your ideal is. And then you'd see that it approximates the figure of the hero in mythology, insofar as it has any utility to you.
I told my friend this, and he said, that is the start of religion, or that is God to people, which...
Yeah, well, that's the intermediary figure in some ways. So there's the transcendent ultimate unity, let's say, but that's ineffable. It's difficult to establish a relationship with. There's some intermediary figure. That's the role that Christ plays in Christianity, right? That's God brought down to earth. Why is Christ an ideal? Because he welcomes the catastrophe of fate. Right, and so there's no ideal person who doesn't do that. I mean, James Bond does that. Seriously, like anybody that attracts your admiration is going to have that welcoming attitude towards even the difficulties of existence. That's going to be a stellar part of their character. Otherwise, you wouldn't admire them. You admire people who can maintain themselves across a catastrophe. Right, so the most admirable person is the person who can maintain themselves the best across the worst possible catastrophe. Right, and so that'll be lurking at the back of the ideal.
So welcoming suffering and welcoming the catastrophe reminds me of Man's Search for Meaning, which for me was one of the most important books I've ever read. And he also quoted a man who has a why can bear almost any how. Right, which is what you quoted earlier, which is really interesting. Are there any other books or authors where if you were to tell the viewers right now, if they started listening to them or reading them, that would make one of the biggest impacts that they can possibly...
Well, that's a good one. Modern Man's Search for a Soul, that's Jung's book. That's a very good book. The Gulag Archipelago is like Viktor Frankl on steroids.
Yeah.
But it's a voyage, that book. Frankl's book has the advantage of being pretty accessible. It's accessible, but it's profound. It's relatively short, so that's a pretty good deal. Notes from Underground, anything Dostoevsky wrote. Beyond Good and Evil, although that's a rough one. That's hard on people, that book. But Viktor Frankl's book is singular in some ways in that popular literature because of its combination of depth and accessibility. So,
I read Crime and Punishment because of you. And this was the first book I've ever read of that type. That was so deep. And it's interesting because now it reminds me of the conversation we had earlier where the emotions that they can bring out in the reader are so gut-wrenching. And it's like pain, but it's positive and negative at the exact same time.
That's right.
And
just like classical music, great classical music.
But it was a whole different set of emotions I feel like I hadn't experienced before. And I found that interesting because I guess overall, there was a lot of meaning in the book.
Right.
And it brought about, a different experience of life I hadn't previously experienced. But at the same time, it was the contending of like the positive and negative emotions. And also, I mean, the
Right.
way that Dostoevsky can write is so descriptive and and accurate.
Well, it's also a great adventure story, a great thriller, great
Yeah.
crime novel. It's an amazing book.
What are your thoughts on Eckhart Tolle?
I don't know enough about him really to